Order. I remind honourable members that there are some changes to normal practice in order to support the new call list system and to ensure that social distancing can be respected. Members should sanitise their microphones using the cleaning materials provided before they use them and dispose of them as they leave the room. Members are also asked to respect the one-way system around the room. Members should speak only from the horseshoe. Members can only speak if they are on the call lists. This applies even if debates are undersubscribed. Members cannot join the debate if they are not on the call list. I remind honourable members that there is less of an expectation that members stay for the next two speeches once they have spoken. This is to help manage attendance in the room. Members may wish to stay beyond their speech, but they should be aware that they may, in so doing, prevent members in the seats in the public gallery from moving to seats on the horseshoe. Order, order. I now call Catherine McKinnell to move the motion.
Thank you, Mr Mundell, and I beg to move that this House has considered E-petitions 33869 and 309851 relating to Covid-19 restrictions on gym and sport. And it's an honour to serve under your chairmanship, Mr Mundell. The two petitions we're debating have a combined total of almost 1 million signatures, and they speak to a very deep concern that we are sitting on a ticking time bomb on physical and mental health. The first petition on preventing the closure of gyms was started by Liam Brannan from North Lincolnshire and has over 614,000 signatures. The second, to exempt golf courses from Covid-19 restrictions, started by Monty Florin from Donington, has over 257,000 signatures. It's become very clear during this pandemic just how much people value sport and exercise. It keeps us fit, it helps maintain good mental health, and it's crucial for our resilience to the virus. With sports facilities closed during the first lockdown, many took up running and cycling. Joe Wicks is now a national hero with an MBE to prove it, leading PE classes from our living rooms. But it's the support and inspiration from gyms and other sports on an ongoing basis that really motivate and keep many people active. My inbox has been flooded with correspondence from people keen to see facilities reopen. To share just a few from my own constituents, Malcolm, 69, says, I try to keep as healthy as I can, especially during the current situation. I go to the gym 3 times a week. Senior citizens like myself should have access to facilities. Natalia says, leisure centres, gyms and swimming pools are an essential part of our community and have massively helped my mental health. It's a place to go to burn off energy and be in my own head that I just cannot achieve in my own home environment. And the power of petitions has clearly paid off, with the government announcing today that gyms and outdoor sports will be able to get going again. The news will come as a relief to many, but it's not the end of the challenge. From financial support for struggling fitness venues to tackling health inequalities and ensuring sport is truly open for all, there is still much more to do. And I urge the government to step up and use this opportunity to build back fitter from the pandemic. Despite Joe's best efforts, we know people have been less active this year. Sport England research shows that more than 3 million people did less exercise during the first lockdown. Sean, a personal trainer in my constituency, has had a similar experience. He says, I've had 80 members who exercise regularly at the gym, but during lockdown, very few kept up with exercise. The average weight gain of my members during the first lockdown was 18 pounds. As Hugh Edwards, CEO of UK Active, has warned, the closure of the sector is creating a second public health crisis in the UK. Many community gyms and sports facilities are now in a very precarious position. The sector usually takes £7.7 billion in membership fees, which have crashed during the pandemic. There are 60,000 self-employed workers whose livelihoods have been destroyed, and many missed out on the self-employment support scheme. UK Active have warned that without urgent government support, up to 20% of facilities could close permanently by the end of the year. The earlier support package from Sport England has been welcome, but many providers, particularly charities and social enterprises, have fallen through the cracks. And while the £100 million fund for leisure centres announced last week is positive, there are still big questions around eligibility. Will councils have the freedom to provide that help where it is needed most? Or will it be a case of devolving that money but with strict criteria attached? The early months of the year are especially crucial. Many fitness businesses make good on all those good New Year intentions. Many people sign up to the gym in January, motivated to get fitter. And as the governments finalise their plans for the Christmas period, the science is saying that tougher restrictions may be needed later. And it would be a catastrophe for many businesses if we faced a spike after Christmas and the government then said they're shutting down again. As Martin, a gym owner, told me, if we are closed for January, we will probably have to close our doors permanently. Clearly, there is a balance to be struck between managing the spread of the virus and the wider public health risks. So I ask the Minister if the government will consider the wider consequences of shutting down this sector in any future lockdown. The concerns of individual sports are wide and varied, and I'll do my best to summarise them in the time that I have. Gyms are where many people spend their fitness time. The sector has put in place stringent measures to be COVID secure, and as petitioner Liam told me, gym users are following the safety rules to the letter because they don't want to see their gyms closed. Data from Test and Trace would suggest it's working, with cases from these venues relatively low in comparison to other settings. Turning to golf, a comparatively safe sport played in wide open space. Petitioner Monty questions why people are permitted to walk across a golf course as a public right-of-way, but they can't play a game with members of their own household. As one of my constituents put it, why is it safe for me to sleep with my wife, yet I can't play a game of golf socially distanced with her? This is a sport that's especially popular with older people too, helping them to stay active later in life. Swimming is one of the most popular physical activities, with 14 million adults going swimming every year. But in many communities, swimming pools haven't reopened since lockdown. West Denton Swimming Pool, in my constituency, is one of those, and the not-for-profit operator has warned it could remain permanently closed. There's a real danger that we're left with a situation where facilities in more affluent areas are able to reopen, whilst those in more disadvantaged areas stay closed, worsening those health inequalities that we know we need to work hard to address. The tennis sector was pleased to reopen in summer as a naturally socially distant sport with a relatively low risk of transmission, but restrictions on sporting activity have hit revenues for community tennis venues, coaches and organisations that help to deliver the sport. Grassroots football clubs have lost significant pitch time this year. The government must lift the ban as an immediate step. But there are concerns that without community sport, through spectators, clubs will struggle to generate the income they need to survive. The spectator funding package announced last week is welcome, but this support must reach clubs at every level so that no community is left out. Gymnastics clubs are a popular fitness activity, especially for our young people who have had a particularly difficult time during this Covid-19 crisis. And even amateur athletes, they need to be able to continue their training. They need to be able to maintain that strength and ability. And I've also been contacted by the horse riding sector, who are deeply concerned that horses can't just be left in the stables for weeks on end. There are so many other sports and activities, and I'm sure we'll hear many from honourable members today. But it's going to take much more than just lifting restrictions to make sport accessible for all. I'm particularly concerned about the impact that this has all had on children. We know that children lose up to 74% of their fitness over the summer holidays when they're away from PE, and with those from the poorest backgrounds affected the most. Swimming lessons have been cancelled, dance classes postponed, football unable to get together. With venues and facilities at risk of permanent closure, these inequalities could well deepen further. So what action do we need to see from government? Well, the first is clarity on the government's strategy and the scientific basis for restrictions. The reopening of gyms and sports is welcome and crucial for the physical and mental health of the country, but the sector needs to know that it will continue and that they won't face another round of restrictions after Christmas. The pandemic has been tough on many sports and businesses, so the second thing they need is financial support. The extension of furlough has helped, but there's a time bomb of rent going into next year. Some facilities have found that they don't meet this prescriptive criteria to access government support. We've already seen established providers like Exercise for Less calling into administrators, and action is needed before more facilities close for good. The Sport and Recreation Alliance are calling for a sport recovery fund to support clubs and facilities across the country. Other helpful measures would include business rates relief in line with other sectors and a cut to VAT to support ticket sales and cash flow. But beyond that direct financial help, there's a strong case for promoting exercise and fitness more widely. Whether that's inducements to buy home exercise equipment or support for gym memberships, just as Eat Out to Help Out was a boost to the hospitality industry, an equivalent to encourage fitness in the new year would be a boost to not just the fitness economy, but to the health of this country. People have faced huge pressures throughout this crisis, and physical exercise is one of the best tools we have to stay healthy and resilient to deal with it. But without renewed effort to get people fit and active, we're storing up bigger public health problems for the future. We also risk reinforcing health inequalities as community leisure centres battle for survival. After a difficult year, we really do now have the opportunity to build back fitter from this pandemic, to make a collective New Year's resolution to get fit and active, and to support local sports clubs, gyms and fitness facilities to ensure that sport truly is accessible to all. So I urge the government to take health and the mental well-being of our country seriously and make this a national priority.
The question is that this House has considered E-petitions 333869 and 309851 relating to Covid-19 restrictions on gyms and sport. I'm not going to engage a formal time limit at this stage, but if everybody wants to get in, members should stick to approximately 4 minutes, and I call Chris Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's fantastic to follow such a good speech from the Honourable Lady from Newcastle upon Tyne North. I think she captured so much of what this debate's about, and she captures so much of what people around the country are feeling. I think there's a certain sense that when you only appreciate something when it's been taken away, and that certainly applies to gyms. And actually, rather perversely, my attendance at the gym went slightly up with the lockdown because I had to make an appointment to go and then felt I had to meet that appointment once I'd made it. So actually helped to some small degree, but I'd hardly recommend having this lockdown approach just for that reason. So many of my constituents have been in touch on this matter. A great many have, because it shows how much it affects them in their lives. And it's not just the physical health, the obvious, it's also the mental health that people have. When so much else in society has been taken away, this is one of those areas that should have been left open, especially because the limited, very limited evidence that there is transmission within the pub environment as well, but also the gym environment. There's very limited evidence on that, and we need evidence-based policy because that's how we give confidence to people to follow the rules and the instructions. We also need to recognise just how much time and effort gym owners and the gym staff have put into making these environments COVID secure. It's phenomenal. When you go, it's not just the people working there, but the people attending the gym are so conscientious in what they're doing with the equipment spaced out, and people cleaning the equipment afterwards. And actually, there are certain things you'd like people to carry on after this COVID phase is washed through entirely. Another indicator, I think, showing the importance of gyms and why they should be left open no matter what future national lockdowns we have, gyms must be left open. Now, there are people in this room who can speak far more clearly and articulately about the situation and experience in Liverpool and the city region, but I think the outcry in Liverpool when that decision was taken to close the gyms, in contrast to Greater Manchester and contrast to Lancashire, I think really showed the importance of keeping the gyms open. And I'm glad that the gyms had reopened in Liverpool. And I think that if you look at the evidence across the board, it's so clear now that gyms and other exercise is incredibly important. But it's not just gyms, it's other forms of sport as well. Team sports. Golf, for example, was highlighted. People, I won't use the same analogy, but people could go for a walk and visit every tee on that 18-hole golf course, and that's legal, but you can't knock a ball, no matter how long it takes, from the tee to the green. You can't go on that same walk. It's not realistic. It's not seen, I think, to be a serious consideration when dealing with COVID. There are problems, and these flaws ought to be resolved. We can understand in the short term why these decisions have been made, but they need to be corrected, I think, for the future. There's also an aspect with team sports as well, about the inherited experience, the passed-on experience. Those people who've been doing the sport for a while, they share that experience with the next generation coming through. We put a break like that in that experience and that sharing of those sports. It's going to be very difficult to get those teams back up and running, especially if this draws on and on. Conscious of time, there is so much more to say on this, but I think the idea of, I'm not overly keen on building back better, but building back fitter, I think, is the focus we all ought to have.
Peter Kyle.
Thank you, Mr Mundell. It's a pleasure to speak in a debate under your chairmanship. And also I'd like to thank my honourable friend, the member for Newcastle North, and her committee for arranging and giving the opportunity for us to have this debate, and particularly those people who signed the petition in the way that they did. It's been very difficult in Parliament and in the House of Commons throughout this period, because when we do get the opportunity to speak and we are successful in the ballot, often you have to speak about what the biggest ticket issue is, and because of the nature of a virus and a pandemic and the medical emergency that we're going through, often it has to be directly limited to that, and you don't get the opportunity to speak to other issues. This is an issue I think is really important, but it's been very difficult to speak to. There's two concerns that I have relating to this debate. The first is the lack of government long-term strategic planning since the very, very beginning, which has impacted people's health and well-being. The second thing relates to the nature of gyms and the importance of them going forward. To the first point, it has been an intense frustration to me, representing the community of Hove and Portslade, which actually had the first outbreak of COVID back in the second week of February. We had the first so-called super spreader at the time, which dominated the news. And I was benefited from having daily briefings from the Chief Medical Officer and from ministers at that time because of the focused nature of it. And they told me at that point that the strategy that they were employing at the very beginning was delay. The reason they wanted to delay was to learn from the foreign experience other countries were having, because it was occurring elsewhere first and fastest. And what I saw was, rolling across the continent of Europe, testing, tracing, and contacting people was absolutely crucial. The second thing we learnt in that period was that a third of people who died in Spain, a quarter of people who were dying in the first wave in France before the outbreak here, were dying in social care, and government did not put a protective ring around those institutions. Now, I understand as we go forward through this that challenges were overwhelming, that gyms had to be closed, exercise had to be limited in the first wave because of the nature of a first wave response. But over the summer, again, rather than preparing for the next stage, summer was all about show some guts and get out onto the beach, get down to bars, get out into the restaurants. None of it was about, let's have a national debate about what the second wave will look like. Because every single pandemic we have data for, the second wave has been larger than the first, including the Spanish flu in 1918. So it was entirely predictable that we would be in the situation we're in today, but we did not prepare for it. And secondly, to the point about gyms and the nature of gyms. Because health and well-being is important. The Prime Minister himself has learnt the experience the hard way, that actually being healthy helps you survive illnesses, including that of Covid-19. And yet, no preparation went into keeping gyms open during the second wave. There are ways of doing it because of the nature of the way that modern gyms operate. The gym that I use has electronic entry systems. They have, since February, limited the number of people that can be in the gym at any one time. I asked government over the summer whether they could limit, whether they could devolve responsibility for which gyms can stay open and which are actually safe to local authorities. Local public health officials should have been able to make an individual assessment as to whether local gyms and individual gyms can do social distancing. We could have had additional measures, masks inside the gym, fewer people, changing rooms being closed because they're areas it's quite difficult to social distance. All of these measures could have been in place. All of them could have been consulted on way in advance of the need for a second lockdown. It wasn't. That is the reason we're in this position. It's not by accident, it is by bad planning. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I call James Grundy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And may I say it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I'd also like to thank the Honourable Member for Newcastle upon Tyne North for securing this debate. The Honourable Lady pointed out that there were about 1 million people who'd signed the various petitions. I suspect I'm not alone in this room in feeling that all 1 million of them have been emailing me personally. I very much welcome the announcement today on gyms. Effectively, gyms are important not just for mental health but physical health as well. As the nights draw in, it becomes increasingly difficult to engage in a way that seems safe in activity and exercise outside. And I think that gyms have done a great deal, as others have spoken on, to try and make themselves COVID secure. So I think it is very important that we've had this announcement today that gyms can reopen. It will be welcomed, certainly, by that very large number of people who've been emailing us all. With regards to sport, obviously, again, in many ways, both the amateur teams, of which there are a very large number in my constituency, both football and rugby and others, they have been sorely suffering from the restrictions that have been put in place. Obviously, in constituencies like mine, and I suspect the honourable members, the constituency is rather poor. Therefore, the lack in ability to take in funds has an effect on the long-term viability of clubs like these. And I should also say that Lee Centurions are very much looking forward to reopening. It is one of the cases that the club is not in the dire circumstances that others in rugby league have been in due to both the help of the government and indeed sound financial management of the club itself. But I would be remiss not to mention their attempt to join the Super League this year, which would be a tremendous boost to both the physical and mental health of all my constituents, as well as the economics of the town. I would just finish off by saying that this has been an incredibly difficult year, and there are still going to be restrictions in place, especially for those in Tier 3 in terms of spectators returning. We're getting there. Hopefully the vaccine will come along in the new year and we'll be able to transition back to normal by Easter. And I do hope that we're able to make that transition as smooth as possible. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Mick Quickly.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mondale. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I thank my honourable friend, the member for Newcastle on Tyne, for securing this debate. I voted for the current lockdown, and I don't regret that decision. Indeed, the scientific advice should have been imposed earlier, and my only regret is that Parliament did not support Labour's proposal for a 2-week circuit break shutdown in October. One of the sectors that has been hardest hit by the lockdown is the gyms. And you can tell I've been to the gyms a lot. It's going to shut down. I've received a considerable number of letters from constituents, gym owners and gym users outlining the problems they have faced. For the owners, there has only been one major complaint. During the full lockdown that began in March, many did not receive the necessary financial support they needed to survive. Notwithstanding the financial support systems put in place by the Treasury as the lockdown unfolded, it became clear that many of their conditions and sub-clauses fell well short of the original whatever it takes promise made by the Chancellor, and many owners were forced out of business. For gym users, the issue was more to do with the fact that exercise is a vital element of both their physical and mental health. The longer they remained closed, the more people's health suffered. During this second lockdown, I want to be clear. If gyms must be closed because they're a major source of infection, then so be it. But the period between lockdown 1 and lockdown 2 raised my suspicion that the government has not followed the science. They did not provide any data to show that during the tier system gyms were a major source of infection. Even worse, when they were forced to close as my constituent was placed in Tier 3, they were given less financial support than previously, despite many having spent considerable amounts of money on making their gyms COVID secure. It seems the government were more concerned at allowing grouse shoots to go ahead regardless than amenities vital to the health and well-being of my constituents. This double standard was exposed even more dramatically when Lancashire went into Tier 3. My constituency gyms were closed, so I would have expected the same rules to apply to Lancashire. That's been sorted out today by the Prime Minister. Could it be that Lancashire County Council or Liverpool City region are so different, but not those in Birkenhead? No reason was given, and gym owners on Merseyside were handed hefty fines for breaking the rules. A classic example in the Dominic Cummings mould. One rule for them and one rule for the rest of us. I was deeply concerned at this, and along with other MPs from the City region, challenged the government to explain there were tiers within tiers and to show us the science. Going forward, no business should be breaking the lockdown, but once it is over, we must guarantee that gym owners are given the financial support that they need to survive. They should be provided with scientific advice on any risks that there may be, so they can take the necessary safety measures. I spoke about gyms, but this also includes indoor and outdoor sports, tennis, football, in line with COVID rules and restrictions. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I call Jane Hunt.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's a pleasure to serve on your council. May I first thank petitioners, the Honourable Member of Parliament for Newcastle upon Tyne North, and of course the 1,659 people in my constituency who have signed these petitions. I recognise that this is an unprecedented situation which has required us to take unprecedented steps to protect the public, including curtailing some freedoms temporarily. However, physical activity and sport play a critical role in building individual resilience and tackling obesity, in addition to the excellent benefits to mental well-being. It is vital that this is recognised. The Loughborough constituency, including its world-renowned university, is synonymous with sporting excellence and is home to a number of national governing bodies. It should therefore come as no surprise that many of my constituents are particularly passionate about health and well-being. This is especially true of the large student population. Mr James Greer, the Athletic Union President of Loughborough Student Union, recently explained to me that organised sport is important to the well-being of all students, not only those who are world champions of one thing or another, in their chosen field. Correspondence I have received from local residents agrees with this point. People from all walks of life would like gyms and sporting facilities of all types back open as soon as possible. So I was ecstatic to hear the words of our Prime Minister earlier this afternoon. Earlier this month, sporting facilities locally followed the new rules and closed. This included CrossFit Gym in a converted warehouse with a huge bay door window, which could remain open for ventilation, in addition to the social distancing they already practice. I would urge that we look at a risk assessment of individual venues in any future arrangements, rather than implementing a blanket ban on the operation of all sporting facilities. Finally, I would like to make a point about swimming. I've been contacted by Swim England, who have set out a compelling case for why it is particularly important for swimming facilities to remain open throughout the outbreak. They have explained that unique properties of water mean swimming pools are an ideal place for people who may otherwise struggle to be active on firm ground. Furthermore, swimming pools are chlorinated, controlled environments where the risk of transmission can be successfully mitigated. This has been proven by the safe way in which they have operated between the first and second lockdown. The impact the restrictions are having on pools is exacerbating the existing problem of permanent pool closures. Before Covid-19, Swim England were already forecasting a 40% reduction in the number of swimming pools by the end of the decade. The £100 million announcement by the government for public leisure centres is very welcome. I am hopeful that this will alleviate the situation. I am keen for swimming facilities to be able to be available both now and in the future as a key element in the education of every child and a much-needed facility for many adults. I would therefore like to put on record my support for Swim England's calls for swimming pools to be allowed to remain open throughout any restrictions, and for gyms and other sporting facilities and activities to start from a presumption of staying open unless their particular circumstances mean that this is unsafe to do so. Thank you.
Nick Smith.
Thank you, Mr Mundell, and thank you too to my honourable friend, the member for Newcastle and Pontyne North, and her Petitions Committee for securing this important debate. Now, I'm proud to chair the all-party group on parkrun, and Mr Mundell, I've seen firsthand the impact that parkrun can have on deprived communities. In a pre-pandemic world, 170,000 people were taking part in this fantastic activity across the UK. Many Saturday mornings at 9 o'clock, I ran for 5 kilometres around our beautiful Park Bryn Bach in Tredegar in Blaenau Gwent. A further 18,000 children took part in junior parkruns on Sundays. Now, I've regularly volunteered on both days. It's a delight to encourage young people to get active. The joy of parkrun is that it's free to join, accessible to all age and ability groups, and led by the community itself. There's a further incentive at Park Bryn Bach where you're given a free piece of toast, Mr Mundell, to have with your tea. So, importantly, as well as being a fun weekend activity, parkrun also has a proven record of addressing health inequalities. Research has shown that parkrun attracts even the hardest to reach groups. Those who live in deprived areas, those who were previously inactive, and those who fit in both groups. Even better, participation in parkrun is often a catalyst for further physical activity. Now, like all sports organisations, parkrun is ready to get back to doing what they do best, encouraging people to get active and to stay healthy. But they are particularly keen to restart events for children and for young people. Children may not be the face of Covid-19 pandemic, but they've certainly been amongst those who've been hardest hit. In areas like mine, keeping children active is a vital part of tackling inequality. Involving children in sports when they are young helps to maintain healthy habits throughout the life course and prevent issues like obesity before they arise. Now, parkrun want to restart events for primary school age children from January because they know that early intervention works. Getting children running again will be good for their well-being, good for their mental health, and good for our communities. Now, I will end by saying that this strange year has reminded us of the importance of our health and well-being like no other. Sport needs to be a fundamental part of the Covid-19 recovery, not an afterthought. Organisations like Parkrun and many others want to restart as soon as it is safe and feasible to do so, but they must also be supported. Now, I'm sure there are many keen park runners in the government, as there are across the country. I can see some running colleagues from across the House today. I would ask them to reflect on the important contribution that parkrun makes and to work to support the organisation as they plan to return. Mr Mundell, getting active again benefits us all, and I look forward to my first parkrun back as soon as possible.
I call Maria Eagle.
Thank you, Mr Mundell, and it's a pleasure to be here with you in the chair. And I'd like to thank the Honourable Lady, the member for Newcastle upon Tyne North, for securing the debate and speaking in the way in which she did at the beginning of it. I have had very, very many constituents, well over 4,000, signed the petition, but hundreds have contacted me separately in addition to ask me to be here today and to put forward their concerns. And we've had a difficult situation in the Liverpool City region area because we've had a bit of hokey-cokey. Open, closed, open, closed, open again next week. But we need a little bit more stability for our gym businesses and we need at least to understand the evidence upon which they have been closed so frequently, given that sage advice from its meeting on the 21st of September was that the government closing gyms would likely have a low to moderate impact on the spread of Covid-19, and that they also said closing gyms could potentially increase health inequalities for those that don't engage in outdoor physical activity due to safety concerns. And we are now entering winter. It's particularly cold in here at the moment, Mr Mundell, and that reminds us that it's about to get a lot colder outside, and perhaps many people who would want to exercise won't feel like doing it in the cold and the wet and the dark and the ice and the snow. So in that sense, if gyms can be safely opened, we want them to be all the way through the winter and for as long as possible thereafter whilst it's safe. The government, my honourable friend from Birkenhead made the point, have not set out the basis upon which they said that gyms ought to close. And my understanding from the industry is that since they reopened on the 25th of July, there had been over 50 million visits with a prevalence rate of the virus of 1.38 cases per 100,000, which isn't bad compared to some other settings. And given the advantages, the health advantages, the well-being advantages in terms of physical health, mental health, of having them open, perhaps there is a balance to be struck there. So I hope the Minister can say whether or not if we we're going back into tier systems at the end of the lockdown, and then in the new year, perhaps there may be more national lockdowns. We don't know yet, but it's certainly something that couldn't be ruled out at this stage. Will the Minister say something in his reply about whether or not, if there does have to be another national lockdown, gyms are going to be expected to be closed again? Or is the government now satisfied that they are safe places and that the advantages in terms of mental and physical well-being and health and fitness are worth keeping them open for? Or should we be watching out yet again for gyms to be closed? One of the things that affects these businesses more than anything is the uncertainty of being open, then being closed, then being opened again, then being closed again. And nobody can plan very sensibly in that kind of situation. So I hope the Minister will have something to say about that. It's welcome that the government have admitted, the Prime Minister has announced when his sound was working that gyms are to reopen next week. Can the Minister say that the government is now satisfied that they're safe, even when there has to be a broader lockdown? And I'd like to just make the point, finally, Mr Mundell, that local councils in deprived areas are often the custodians and operators of gyms, of fitness facilities. They are the ones who have only had half of the costs of COVID reimbursed to them. They are the ones who, even though they have deprived communities with more people at risk of ill health, have the toughest opportunity, of the toughest way and the toughest chance of keeping their gyms open because of their own financial situation. So perhaps he can say something about what's going to be done by the Chancellor next week to make sure that our leisure and sporting facilities can stay open in our most deprived areas. Thank you.
Call Simon Jupp.
Thank you, Mr Mundell. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I am very grateful for the opportunity to speak in this afternoon's timely debate. It's a pleasure to follow the Honourable Member for Garston and Halewood. We've heard some excellent points this afternoon about the merits of exercise for our physical and mental well-being. I'll take personal note of all of them. As the MP for East Devon in the South West, the communities I represent depend on their local gym and leisure centre regardless of their age. I've had constituents in their 80s contact me, really disheartened and not seeing friends at weekly aerobic classes or swimming this month, for example. And they are some of the 1,000 plus signatures to this petition from my area. Over 500 members of the leisure centre group LED, supported by East Devon District Council, have emailed me asking that the physical activity centre is recognised as essential and is able to remain open safely over the winter months. It's really important to recognise that we must stay healthy, but it's also important to stay healthy safely in an environment designed to help people reach their goals. Gyms and leisure centre owners, such as Cranford Sports Club in Exmouth, are desperately worried money is drying up after receiving welcome government funding since March to keep afloat and keep staff on their books. They sometimes feel their role in our communities is underappreciated. Cranford Sports Club is so much more than its title. It hosts Help for Heroes, Parkinson's support groups, disabled racket sports, as well as junior and teen tennis and badminton. They're also a centre for GP referrals from the 2 nearby medical practices. Those recovering from serious medical conditions have closely supervised exercise sessions in small groups, which reduces the burden on our NHS. Close proximity to the new Deaf Academy in Exmouth has already meant that children facing profound difficulties are being taught to swim safely in its small pool with their carer. And the new Move Forward gym in Ottery St Mary offers memberships to NHS-referred cancer patients, as well as special programmes for cancer survivors as well. Great work is being done locally across East Devon. The government has announced a £100 million support fund for leisure centres, which will help cover losses incurred by the pandemic. Whilst we await these specific allocations, councils, including East Devon District Council, should also look to the discretionary grant funding scheme to support local gyms and independent leisure centres. I know the members at Cranford Sports Club in Exmouth would welcome the support. Today, we should welcome the move from national to local restrictions next week. I believe Devon should be in the lowest tier of restrictions to reflect the hard work and significant sacrifices we've made to suppress the virus. As the Prime Minister announced, leisure centres and gyms will reopen next week. I may even sign up myself. But councils must explore every opportunity to safely reopen their leisure centres next week to support those they don't have a hand in running.
Thank you. I call Mark Pausing.
Thank you, Mr Mundell, and it's a pleasure to speak under your chairmanship, and I congratulate the Honourable Lady Member for Newcastle upon Tyne and bringing forward a very timely debate. Mr Mundell, I want to speak about rugby. And the Honourable Member for Lee, who in his place mentioned Rugby League, but I want to talk about Rugby Union. But both codes had their birthplace in my constituency. And Rugby Union is normally played on a Saturday, and there was a pretty good win by England on Saturday, Mr Mundell, if you have noticed. But the busiest day for a rugby club is a Sunday. It's a Sunday morning when there are hordes of young people taking part in mini rugby at the youngest levels, often chasing the ball around like bees around a honeypot. And we often think of rugby as being a game of big men running into each other, and it is certainly Pete, forgive me. Well, I was going to say big men, but I was going to draw attention to the fact that rugby is a sport for players of all sizes, and we have the mini game, the junior game, veterans, and women's rugby, which is a part of every club. And I would add that the principal rugby club in rugby got into financial difficulty, and it was the community game, the youngsters, the women's game that kept that club alive. And Neil's Back's book, The Death of Rugby, draws attention to that. And rugby is one of the most social of games, where amongst the values are loyalty to teammates. And people will sometimes see a bit of argy-bargy on the pitch, but it's traditional to always meet after the game in a clubhouse and have a drink with somebody on the opposite member, on the player on the opposite side. And many players have missed the social side as much as they've missed the action on the pitch. Now, the top tier of the game has resumed. We have an international new tournament, and we have the Premiership, all without spectators, which of course is where the major clubs rely on their money, with local clubs of course relying tremendously on hospitality and bar takings. And at all levels of the game, welcome the package that was announced by the Minister only last week. It's much appreciated. I mentioned, Mr Mundell, the different versions of the game. The one I didn't mention is called Golden Oldies, and that's a version played by the parliamentary rugby team. That's a game that enables old people to continue playing. There's less contact, and with that less contact, we have a safer game. But many of the players in the parliamentary team are old players who know what to do, but aren't fit enough to do it. And that's where the issue of gyms comes into importance, because we go to the gym to make certain that we are able to do what we know we should be doing. And I've had a huge representation from members of gyms in my constituency. The biggest site and the one most contact I've had is from the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Centre, which is owned by Rugby Borough Council, the local authority, which I think is an issue that one of the other members has raised. It's operated by GLL Leisure under the better brand, and that's where I have my personal membership. And like many, I missed it when the first lockdown took place, and I have seen the very substantial measures that the club have put in place to make sure it's safe. There's a book time slot, there are no showers and changing rooms, the machines are set apart, the sanitizer readily available with a trigger spray immediately adjacent to most machines, and I see everybody honouring the etiquette of wiping down before and after use. So I've had many of my constituents tell me how important going to the gym is to their mental as well as their physical health, and we very much welcome the measures that have been announced today that will enable us to return on the 3rd of December.
Thank you, Mr President. I'm very glad you didn't define old in that speech. I call Nusrat Ghani.
Thank you, Mr Mandel. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I congratulate the Honourable Lady for securing this debate. And we are hearing today that we are going to be exiting a national lockdown, but moving into more a tiered approach, although I'm incredibly anxious how that will be prescribed. As a member of the COVID recovery group, I'm pleased that some of our concerns seem to have been met, looking at the 10 p.m. curfew, opening up outdoor sports, opening up COVID-safe gyms, and opening up COVID-safe retail as well. Look, COVID is a deadly disease. Like many in this room, we would have lost members of our own family and friends to COVID. But just as much as we want to limit the spread of the infection, we need to make sure that we have a long-term strategy for living with the virus that goes beyond Christmas. That's the certainty that our sports and our gym sector needs. I'm just going to raise 4 very quick cases with my right honourable friend, the Minister. One is, of course, gyms. I have a Mr Daniel Sangar who lives in Uckfield, and he wrote in, how can we justify that a takeaway such as McDonald's that's serving fast food can be open, whereas he has had to close down his business. Of course, incredibly grateful for the furlough scheme, but people have been limiting their subscriptions, and a business like theirs may have to face further financial damage and may have to lay off people in the future. Of course, my honourable friend knows that Wilden is stunning. We have lots of golf courses. And Mr Robert Hesse wants to ask, how can he walk down the street with one of his golfing friends but cannot play golf with them in one of our stunning golf sites in Wilden? Hopefully my right honourable friend can explain that away. We have a couple of local football clubs I want to talk about. These are just low-key local football clubs doing great work for our community. Uckfield, Crowborough, Halsham Football Club, and they've been put under extreme hardship with the uncertainty that the lockdown has provided. Perhaps my right honourable friend can explain I believe the £550 million that was going to go to local football clubs and associations, how that will be spent in an area such as mine. But I want to go on to a slightly bigger picture. I hope that my right honourable friend can try and answer some of these questions, and I'm trying to put them forward in the most constructive way possible. It is not rare that when large organisations face a huge amount of risk, that those managers, our ministers, tend to go native, which is they start to become deal makers rather than deal questioners. Deal makers, what should stay open, what shouldn't stay open, instead of deal questioners asking what is the real scientific evidence behind the decisions that we're taking. Taking that on board, I would like my right honourable friend to address 3 key things. Can my right honourable friend work with the government to provide us, backbenchers, with the evidence that shows us the impact, the real impact on people's livelihoods for every restriction that's put in place? Can my right honourable friend work with the government to show us the full cost-benefit analysis of every proposed restriction? Not only does it affect people's livelihoods, but their mental and physical health as well. These lockdowns have been particularly harsh in East Sussex and my constituents of Wilden, where we've had a very low infection rate, very few beds have been taken up, but people's livelihoods have been lost. And finally, I'll ask my right honourable friend if he can work with the government to publish the models that inform the policies that they are taking forward, because we as backbenchers should be able to review the data that is made available to the ministers and the government so we can make the best judgment on behalf of our constituents. The cure that we're prescribing of endless lockdowns runs a very real risk of being worse than the disease itself. It's time to start removing these restrictions. We have a vaccine coming down the line. That's fantastic news. And we need to make sure that people can live their lives to their fullest. Every restriction needs evidence. Surely that's the basics of good democracy.
Catherine West.
Thank you, Mr Mandel, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship and a delight to be in another debate led by the member for Newcastle upon Tyne North. And perhaps Mr Mandel, like you, having a rugby fan who's a Scotland supporter, maybe not had such a great weekend. However, we must go forward, hoping... But we live in hope with the navy jersey and the white thistle every week. One never knows one's luck. Like the member for Wealden, I have 2 golf courses in my constituency and many upset constituents not able to keep up with their constitutional, but also specifically the indoor piece, so gyms, leisure centres, indoor tennis and cricket centres, and of course swimming pools. I briefly wanted to focus on swimming in my short remarks, and I know that the member for Loughborough has already outlined the lifelong benefits of swimming. But as the chair of the all-party group, could I thank the Minister for attending twice to our all-party group, for listening carefully, and crucially for ensuring that school swimming has continued in this second lockdown. I think it's so important that we don't lose a whole cohort of children who then carry a lack of swimming ability through all of their secondary school years and beyond, and then end up in a gap year in Spain or somewhere and then tragically lose their lives because they've never learnt to swim. So really pleased that the swimming lessons have continued. Of course, it does depend, however, on one's access to a swimming pool, and we know that the statistics on swimming pool sufficiency have actually dropped in the last decade due to austerity and due to developers not building enough swimming pools in their Section 106 and CIL agreements. And I do hope that when the Minister gets a chance, he and his officials will look at swimming pool sufficiency, because there's lots of regions in the UK where children will not have access to that crucial hardware so that they can actually learn to swim. And I do also hope that in any time that he may have as well, in terms of being strategic, that he will look at the role of swimming instructors and paying swimming instructors properly and having them in proper arrangements, whether that's through local authorities or third sector. The other element of the announcement I'm very pleased about is the fact that the third sector will be able to apply for funds. Obviously, all of our local authorities are really stretched, and so some money which was meant to be spent, one would hope, on the impacts of COVID and mitigation, there hasn't been enough to cover all of the leisure estate in many of our local authority areas. So I'm very pleased with the provider in my local authority, which is Fusion, which is a charity, that they will be able to apply for funds to the Minister. In my constituency, I have a very active outdoor swimming group. It's called the Park Road Users Group. Very vocal about how much they're missing their swimming, very keen to get back in the swimming pool. And I think of a case study of Hesketh Benoit, who's one of our key swimmers, swims every morning. He's up at 6, he's down at the swimming pool, and he also runs basketball for young people during the summer and other sports. And he's a fantastic example of a lifelong swimmer. I also wanted to pay tribute to those workers who look after our swimming pools locally. And I think of the West Reservoir in Hackney, the ponds on the Hampstead Heath, all of these outdoor swimming areas, because there is some research which has come out recently that suggests outdoor swimming can play a role in preventing dementia, something which I would recommend to the Minister to look at. Just in closing remarks, I do hope that as the fund is brought forward, that the Minister will come back to this House and tell us exactly how it's been spent, and hopefully that our disadvantaged communities will have access to sport in the same way that everybody else does. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Mandel. It's a great pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I was sorry to miss the speech of the Honourable Lady for Newcastle North, and congratulate her on her debate. We had a few delays in the chamber, I think, as colleagues have referred to, but I'm glad to be here because we discovered, as has been referred to, that sport will be coming back. That is a very welcome development, but it still begs the question of why it was cancelled in the first place. Because the one thing that we know about sport and exercise is that there's scarcely anything better in terms of being a defence against COVID, whether that is practised by older people that have been referred to in the debate, or indeed children. So to have a comprehensive ban on an activity that helps guard against COVID is a mystery. The mystery is deepened further when one considers that outdoor sport is at this moment prevented from taking place as well, because the incidence of transmission of COVID out of doors across the whole world is virtually unknown. Again, of all of the environments in which to feel most secure and most safe from this very dangerous and serious disease, it is outdoors. And so the fact that for the last month, the activities that have been enjoyed by our constituents up and down the country has been suppressed for, it seems to me, no good reason, is something that we need to learn the lessons of and to prevent happening in the future. And it's not the first time that this has happened. During the summer, I, supported by members from all sides of the House, asked the same questions as to why cricket had been, again, banned in leisure settings involving children and adult teams across the country. Again, a more COVID-secure sport, it is difficult to imagine. We know on the Select Committee that I chair, the Science and Technology Select Committee, that Professor Whitty and Sir Patrick Vallance both commented on the very low incidence and risk from infection from outdoor sport, and that the impact on the R rate, so far as it can be modelled, is negligible. But one of the things that they said that concerned me was that their advice was at a general level, a strategic level, and they didn't give specific advice on activities like sports. Now, that is a concern, because as is evident from the subscription and the participation in this debate, it's something that is of great importance to all of our constituents. I respect completely the expertise of our leading scientists, but we need to have the ability to influence these decisions and to scrutinise the evidence that is being adduced to cause lockdowns, and not just to have to accept a fait accompli. So I hope the Minister, whose commitment and indeed passion for sport is something that is known to all members of the House, will be able to take from this debate a resolution that in the future it will be possible to take the views of members and to share with members the evidence on which important decisions are based, so that the return to sport that we have will be something that will endure, and we won't be subject again to these unexpected and, it seems to be, unnecessary restrictions. I hope the Minister in his closing remarks may be able to confirm that the lifting of restrictions that we've heard in the Chamber just a few moments ago today will also extend to the supporters in person, the spectators at amateur clubs and children's sports. My honourable friend, the member for Wilton, referred to Crowborough Football Club, and she will know that the much-awaited derby that will take place between Tunbridge Wells and Crowborough FC on Boxing Day, in which I will be there to support my home team. Exciting and a red-letter day, though it will be, exciting as it will be. I suspect that there will be room for social distancing in the outdoors there. So I hope that there will be no restrictions on us being able to support that and the many other sports, rugby, whether it's tennis, golf has been referred to, and I hope that many of us will be able to enjoy that on Boxing Day and many other weekends ahead.
To serve under your chairmanship and to follow the right honourable gentleman for Tunbridge Wells. I want to concentrate particularly on gyms rather than the more general comments that we've had on sport, all of which I support. And I also want to congratulate my honourable friend, the member for Newcastle North, who has persuaded the Prime Minister before she even stood up to speak to do what she's asked him to do in this debate, but I do feel that we need to hear from the Minister in a bit more detail, given the arbitrary nature of some of what's gone on in the last year, particularly with respect to gyms. I want to mention Nick Whitcomb, who owns and runs Bodytech in Morton, who's a constituent of mine, and also Thea Holden, who runs Empowered Fit, a constituent of mine, although the gym itself is close to Arrow Park Hospital, I believe in the my honourable friend's constituency. We all know how important the battle against obesity is if we're going to make Covid-19 less of a problem, and we all know how important it is that people should have the chance to become fitter, which is guaranteed if you manage to get yourself embroiled in a gym. I want to talk also, though, about the mental health benefits, which have been alluded to and are now very, very well known, of being able to work out. They're shown everywhere, and I think both Nick and Thea Holden, my constituents, would attest to that. But there's another aspect as well in dealing with health conditions that being able to go to the gym can do that. And certainly Thea, who now runs her own gym, suffers from Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which results in multiple joint dislocations. And she was actually being confined to a wheelchair and on medication prior to discovering that this disease could be managed with gym going. And she actually is now drug-free, wheelchair-free, and very fit as a result of the work that she did. She helps clients with the same issue and keeps them out of wheelchairs. And she told me when I spoke to her the other day that some of the people that she helps have been going backwards because the gym has been closed and they can't get that workout which they need. Also, obviously, mental health. She has clients who, one particular person who had a history of self-harm, suicide and other mental health conditions, who couldn't really relate to many people, but found the atmosphere in a gym and the friends that you make in a gym and the effort that you can put in there, the support you get there, the environment that there is there, was actually very good for her own mental health. And I think Thea herself worries that as her gym is closed, people are really missing out and being put in danger. I wanted to spend just two things. Nick, who runs Bodytech in Morton, is asking why we can't make health and fitness an essential service, not like a blue light service, but recognise the role that it plays in terms of physical and mental health and well-being, and protect it more. And can I ask the Minister, when he stands up and responds to this debate, to tell us what the scientific basis for the decision to close was, to admit publicly that we now know more about this disease and that we know that the prevalence of COVID was very, very low over the summer months, which makes it much safer with the process that's been put in place for gyms to remain open. And I hope that he will say that even in Tier 3+, gyms can look forwards in the next period to being able to remain open.
Thank you. If the Shadow Minister and Minister can confine the remarks to about 10 minutes each, then that will allow Catherine McKinnell to respond to the debate. Alison McGovern.
Thank you, Mr Mundell. I will do my best to do so. I would like to begin by thanking the member for Newcastle North for leading the debate in which she did. She made a compelling argument, and as my very good friend, the member for Wallasey, has just mentioned, so good, she's already persuaded the Prime Minister. What more could we ask for? I'd also like to thank all members for their excellent contributions in the debate so far, and we had a huge number of contributions from all over the country, but I do feel, Mr Mundell, Merseyside has been represented well this afternoon. It is quite possibly the sporting capital of the nation, Mr Mundell, so we'd expect nothing less. It is home of the champions, you know, just saying. But this is a very important debate, and the fact is, Mr Mundell, it does come at a slightly odd moment in the day when we have heard the Prime Minister in the Chamber announced some of the details about the next phase of our pandemic response, including the important details that we've heard members discuss. But we're yet to see how this will practically affect our daily lives. The fact is, all of us stood here this afternoon don't exactly know which areas will be in which tiers. So we're still at a bit of a loss to understand how this announcement will affect our sporting and our physical activity in our constituents. And that feeling is nothing new, because too often, Mr Mundell, unfortunately, it has felt in this crisis, sport and our physical and mental well-being that comes from it has felt like an afterthought. And that isn't really good enough, because every member who's spoken today has said that it is a fundamental part of life for so many of us in this country. So we need better. And as the member for Newcastle North and others have said, we need clarity from the government on what is going to happen. Not just what's going to happen at the end of this month and into December, but what's going to happen in the months to come. So I have some questions for the Minister, Mr Mundell, which I hope will help with that clarity. Whilst the return of sports and gyms is welcome, as I've just said, we know we're not out of the woods yet. And what will happen to sport if further lockdowns are required in January? Will sport be cancelled again? Will team sports be cancelled? Will gyms be affected again? And as the member for Tunbridge Wells has just asked, what is going on with spectators? Because we've seen from the Secretary of State's tweets that we will see spectators back, but I would like to know why those numerical limits in terms of number of spectators have been chosen. And Mr Mundell, I won't ask any further questions about spectators at this moment, because we haven't got time for all the questions that there are going to be in the coming days about spectators' return to sport. This is very important to people, so I know we'll return to that potentially on Wednesday when we'll be talking in this place about football. So, second question, we do need to consider the possibility of a third wave. We hope it won't happen. We all hoping that the vaccines that are being working on and mass testing, which Merseyside has been trialling, is going to work. But if there is a third wave and we face a future lockdown, what will happen? There are a number of leisure centres up and down the country, they were mentioned by the member for Garston actually, who have been shut since March. Many of them serve some of the most deprived communities in our country, and several of them have been raised by members of Parliament in our House. So will the Minister commit to getting in touch with each of those members of Parliament and shifting heaven and earth to getting those leisure centres open? I know he's allocated £100 million, but there's a difference between paying the money out and getting the doors open. So will he work with me to get the doors open of those leisure centres? Now, I mentioned the mass testing just before. So can the Minister say what conversations he's had with Mayor Steve Rotherham or Mayor Joe Anderson or Director of Public Health Matt Ashton in Liverpool to work on how we can use the lessons coming out of the testing there on sporting participation, because that's got to be part of the answer, how we use testing. So will he have those conversations with people in Liverpool? Fourthly, sports have made huge changes to their coaching processes to make themselves COVID safe. So has that work been a waste, or will the Minister encourage sports and others to work with them on that plan B, so that if we do go back into lockdown again, we know those COVID safe measures can help us keep sports open in the future? And fifthly, this is very important, several members have mentioned it, what conversations has he had with the schools minister? Because our kids, it's been said, my friend from Wallasey said it just now, our kids have really lost out massively from this. So will he explain what steps that his department is taking with the Department for Education to make sure that every child has sporting opportunities, if not before Christmas, then into the new year? And on the health of the nation, whilst we're on our children, Mr Mundell, we've got to be able to look at this and see the facts of what this virus has done, not just to those who are vulnerable, but to all of us. It's had an impact on the health of every single one of us. So what work has he commenced with the Department of Health to understand the physical health of the nation and assess where sport can help and create a proactive plan? There were things in the Conservative manifesto I noticed in December actually about this, including on sports facilities and an allocation of some money, and this is an issue close to my heart, Mr Mundell, so forgive me for banging on about it, but grassroots football is in dire need of better facilities. And there was promises made in the Conservative manifesto about it. So can he say where he's up to with that plan? Because as ever, we are a constructive opposition, and there's things that he wants to do to improve our sporting facilities. I, for one, will help him, Mr Mundell. So this brings me to my 7th and final question for the Minister. And I hope to come in a little under time to give the Minister plenty of time to fulsomely answer these questions. The member for Tunbridge Wells quite rightly said that the Chief Science Officer and others, they can give broad advice, but not specifically on these sporting issues that we've been raising today. So it's absolutely clear from all sides of the House that we must go much further if we truly care about the health of the nation. So we need a proper plan. And the future of our country, its economy, its happiness, its longevity depends absolutely on the well-being of us all, the well-being of the people in that country. So I asked the Minister, and he's heard me ask this before, and I'm sorry to be boring about it, but we need a cross-government, comprehensive plan for well-being. Beyond this virus, looking to the future, is he prepared to create that? Where is it? Because the government has spent far too long running from crisis to crisis. Frankly, when it comes to sport, Mr Mundell, and everything else, we need much better than that.
Well, thank you, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Mr Mundell. And I'm very grateful to the Honourable Member for Newcastle upon Tyne North for bringing this debate on a very important subject, and to the hundreds of thousands of people, nearly 1 million, I believe, who have signed the petitions, and indeed to colleagues, members who have spoken so eloquently today and who I've had many conversations with over the past few weeks and months. It's worth noting at this point that since this debate was scheduled, we have entered a 4-week period of national measures, which means almost all businesses, including gyms and leisure centres, have had to close their doors to the public. And as all present will be aware, the national lockdown will last until the 2nd of December, with the vital purpose of protecting our NHS and saving lives. As my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, announced in the main chamber earlier today, in fact I think he's still on his feet, organised grassroots sport will be allowed to resume from the 2nd of December, albeit with some restrictions on higher risk activity in very high alert levels, areas, and also there'll be some restrictions on indoor adult sports. But this is a good day for sport in terms of the announcements. Gyms and leisure centres will also be allowed to reopen in all tiers. As ever, we expect social distancing and the requirements for heightened hygiene to remain in place, and more detail will be available on this announcement in the coming days. Now, the importance of sport and physical activity for the nation's physical and mental health has never been more apparent, as many honourable members have mentioned today. Sport can be one of the most powerful defences against the current Covid-19 pandemic, and we will need raised levels of fitness amongst the population as we prepare to return to our normal lives, now that the prospect of an effective vaccination programme looks imminent. Now, as we have said before, nobody, including me as Sports Minister, wanted to be in the position of having to introduce further national restrictions and restrictions on sport. However, as the Prime Minister said at the time of introducing the second lockdown, with the virus spreading faster than expected, we could not allow our health system to be overwhelmed. We introduced very serious lockdown measures, and the question was not making exceptions for what could open, but the fact that we needed to go on a lockdown and only allow people out for a very strict and limited number of reasons, including going out to exercise, albeit not necessarily the exercise that everybody would personally desire. Now, the national restrictions are designed to get the R rate under control through limiting social contact and reducing transmissions. And in order for these measures to have the greatest impact, we all needed to sacrifice doing some of the things that we would otherwise like to do for a short period of time. And as the Prime Minister has announced today, we've committed to that. It will be for a short period of time, and on the 2nd of December, after the 2nd of December, we will be able to go back to some of those activities. Now, of course, it's also important to bear in mind that unlike the previous lockdown, during this lockdown, behind closed doors sport is still taking place, that at schools which are still open, and I have spoken and do speak regularly with the schools minister, PE lessons are therefore able to take place. And of course, exercise is able to be conducted with one other person, recognising, for example, that we are now in the winter, and many people, for safety reasons and others, wish to exercise with another person from outside their own household. So sport has been a priority and will continue to be a priority. And even during peak lockdown back in March, unlike many other countries, exercise was still an absolute priority that could be conducted by everybody in this country. That was not the case everywhere around the world. That shows how important sport and physical activity is to the UK. Now, there have been, though, many calls from many sports representatives and the public for exemptions to these current restrictions, some of them giving highly plausible reasoning why their individual sports should be exempt, and I've heard many of those arguments again today, and of course the petitions are good examples of this. I've heard these arguments from gyms, from golf, from tennis, from swimming, from basketball, from children's football, from parkrun, from cricket, from rowing, indeed many other sports. That itself exemplifies why we've had the problem and the issues we are facing. Because I'm sure, as honourable members will understand, the difficulty here is that when you unpick one thing, the effectiveness of the whole package of restrictions is compromised. Once we keep taking the individual bricks out, the whole wall falls down. And instead of there being one exception for one person to conduct their preferred activity, all of a sudden it gets to tens, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of potential additional interactions, the very thing that we wanted to avoid, because the focus had to be on minimising the number of potentially risky interactions. That is not to say at all that any individual sport is high risk. Quite the contrary. If we thought that, we would have never allowed them to open in the first place. The point, though, is, and as many have mentioned, there is a small risk of infection rate spreading at each of these interactions. A small risk, a very, very small risk. And therefore, we had to take actions, and the Prime Minister was very clear, no exemptions, partly for clarity, but also to make sure everybody understood this is a really serious, deadly serious lockdown. And unfortunately, that meant that everybody had to make some compromises. And I know that closing these facilities was incredibly inconvenient, compromised people's health, was very upsetting and disturbing. But there is no doubt that the restrictions we've all had to go under over the last few weeks and for the next week or so will have saved lives. And therefore, that inconvenience, I think, was worth it.
You need to come to the horseshoe in order to speak.
Thank you. There is a number of colleagues have raised the concern about evidence and data, and as my honourable friend, the Minister, is saying, about the threat, the risks that interaction poses, there must be data, there must be evidence now accumulated over the last 9 months or so. So a report could be published, a report could be shared in terms of evidence on the impact that opening clubs, opening gyms would have in terms of COVID transmission.
I thank the honourable member for his comments, and many people have asked for this data. I think I've articulated the point is the possibility of there being a risk. And as the chief medical officers and others have articulated, there is always a risk with any potential social interaction. We saw death rates go from a dozen or so a day in August to getting to dozens a day, and in fact now over 500. That's the evidence. That's why we had to take significant action. Now, I've always said, though, that as soon as it's possible to start lifting restrictions, grassroots sport will be amongst the first to return, and that has been confirmed by the Prime Minister today, as promised. I would like to pay tribute to all the hard work carried out by sports governing bodies and clubs across the country in making sure that we were ready for the return of sport. From gyms, leisure centres and pools to rowing, to badminton clubs, across all sports. Yeah.
I'm very grateful to him. Does what he's just said imply that if there's further national lockdown in the new year, that the gyms will all have to close again?
The Honourable Lady is raising an important point, but actually let's be glass half full rather than glass half empty in this issue. We are now at the point where we are reopening sport, and the Honourable Lady and everybody knows that we have to respond to the circumstances at the time. It's ridiculous to ask a minister to come to this dispatch box and make promises based on future hypothetical scenarios. We will base decisions based on the information at the time, but we are now in a pattern, and we've got the vaccination coming that I am very confident we are now looking positively to a much, much more positive future, and that is what the government will be focused on. And I would like to give way in a moment. I'd like to say tribute to the hard work and effort made by so many sports bodies and clubs who have made sure that they have made their facilities as safe as possible and minimise the risk. This has involved a huge amount of work at not inconsiderable cost to ensure that social distancing, improved hygiene and other measures have been implemented to increase the safety and lower the risk of their members and indeed their staff. And I would like to thank all of those who've played their part, many of whom volunteered to go the extra mile for the work which has got us this far. Yeah.
Mr. Mandel, and I thank the Minister for giving way. Look, this is a simple question. He thanks sports for the work that they've done, and I agree with him. And either the work that's been done to make sports COVID safe is good enough that if we have future lockdowns, they won't be included, or they need to prepare that if there is a future lockdown, they could be included. Which is it?
What everybody's going through at the moment, the sacrifices everybody is making, is precisely to reduce the chances of an additional lockdown, a future lockdown, and I appreciate the work that everybody is doing. Now, the return of golf has had a tremendous amount of support from the public, as seen by over 250,000 people signing one of the petitions that led to this debate today, and golf has had great reach across society for all ages, backgrounds and abilities. It brings people together and experience the great outdoors. And like gyms, leisure centres and pools, the golfing community has made strenuous efforts to make sure that their players can take part safely. And once again, I would like to pay tribute to their shared efforts. I will say to the Honourable Lady, every piece of effort and energy gone into making grounds, sports facilities safe has been well worth it. That's exactly why we've been able to make the progress we have so far. And the government recognised these efforts and the importance of golf by ensuring that golf courses were one of the first facilities to be reopened following the lockdown in the spring. Now, sports and physical facilities are at the heart of our communities and play a crucial role in supporting adults and children to be active. This government has provided unprecedented support to businesses through tax reliefs, cash grants, employee wage support, which many sports clubs have benefited from. Many leisure centres have faced acute challenges during the pandemic, and that's why on the 27th of October, the government announced a £100 million support fund for leisure centres affected by the pandemic, which many honourable friends have mentioned today. Now, my department is working currently closely with Sport England and MHCLG on the design of that scheme, and further details will be released shortly. Once the funds are open, I urge local authorities to bid for the money, and I hope that people will make the most of these precious local facilities once they are open again. Now, this is all on top of the funding that DCMS arm's-length bodies, Sport England, has also already provided. This has comprised over £220 million to directly support the sport and physical activity sector, with £35 million set aside as a community emergency fund for our very important sports clubs and exercise centres through this pandemic. And we're continuing to work with organisations to understand what they need and how we may be able to support them into the future when restrictions are lifted. Now, I'm in regular dialogue with representatives from sports governing bodies, member bodies and providers of leisure facilities and gyms through the DCMS-hosted Sports Working Group. The Working Group provides a forum for representatives from the sports sector to discuss the impact of the pandemic on the sector and allows members to put questions and suggestions directly to myself and to the department. And I'm grateful to all of those working on this scheme and for their continued advice and support. I'd like to thank honourable members for their interest and their contributions today, helping getting sport and physical activity up and running again. I look forward to further increasing our efforts, particularly now with the increasing good news about vaccines. People from all backgrounds and all levels of ability should have the opportunity to play sports and keep active, and that is a commitment of this government.
Mr Mundell, and thank you all honourable members for what I think has been an excellent debate, putting the arguments on behalf of all of the petitioners who live in our constituencies and many who are not represented in this room today because there aren't enough spaces for members to come and speak. But I know that members of the public in numbers, huge numbers, have been emailing their MPs, and it's a very powerful way of conveying the strength of feeling on this issue. And my inbox now, though, and this is my personal inbox, is now pinging with emails from local sports clubs who are getting in touch, absolutely delighted with the news that they're now able to reopen. Sports clubs for my children's swimming lessons, for my daughter's gymnastics, are getting in touch to say how delighted they are, which is why it is hugely concerning that we're not getting any certainty really from the government that this could be long-lasting in any way. And I absolutely appreciate, we all appreciate, that we can't predict this virus. We can't predict the outcome of how things will go. But we do know some things. We have learned some things over the last 9 months. And I would have thought that one of the lessons we have learned is that for people to stay fit, active and healthy is absolutely fundamental. It's not a nice to have. It's not a leisure activity. It's a fundamental part of people's health and their mental well-being and their ability to stay resilient and resistant to this virus. And so I had hoped to hear much more clarity from the Minister that any of the relaxation that's currently being announced today will not mean in January, potentially, these very sports that are delighted today to finally be able to reopen may have to close down again. It's just unthinkable, to be perfectly honest. And so I really hope that the Minister can go away, and once the government has had an ability to iron out all of the detail in relation to the current relaxations being announced, that the government can give greater clarity and that certainty and that reassurance to these sports clubs that it's not just going to be a matter of weeks that they are now going to be reopened until we see another spike after Christmas, which will come as a result of potential relaxation, but also that inability to properly track and trace this virus through a system that truly works. And the final point, and this has been made by everybody as well, is how vital it is that we have the resources in place to ensure sport in every community, not just those where they have people who can pay and who can keep these sports, the whole variety of sports and gyms and leisure and swimming pools, and can keep them afloat. But those communities that had those facilities before this pandemic, they should have them afterwards. And the government should make a commitment, in fact, not only to making sure that every community that had those sports facilities still has them after this pandemic, but actually that we build on them and we make them even better, and that we come out of this pandemic knowing not only that sport and health and fitness and mental well-being matter in this country, but we're truly going to rebuild back fitter and even better than we were before.
The question is that this House has considered E-petitions 333869 and 309851 relating to COVID-19 restrictions on gyms and sport. As many are of that opinion, say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. In order to allow safe exit of honourable members participating in this item in business and safe arrival of those participating in the next, I am suspending the sitting for 2 minutes. Order, order. And I will also convey members' concerns about the temperature in this room to the necessary authorities, and I'm sure Mr Gray, who's going to chair the next debate, will do likewise.